Okay, I call to order the December 2024 meeting of the Finance and Operations Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to those who are joining by way of live stream and those attending in our boardroom here in the Twin Cities campus and by way of Zoom. Let me welcome our student representative for today, Simon Moreno. Hi, Simon. I saw you at Duluth, and Jocelyn Stern from the Twin Cities campus. Hi, Jocelyn. Before we begin, I would like to welcome Executive Vice President Greg Goldman as the new Senior Leader Liaison for Finance and Operations Committee. I'm sure I speak for the rest of the committee when I express how much we are looking forward to working with you to advance the committee's work, benefit from your counsel, and together support the university's mission. President Cunningham, would you like to share a welcome as well?
I would. Thank you, Chair Hipsch and members of the board. Before you proceed with the agenda, I want to take a moment to introduce Greg Goldman and welcome him to his first Finance and Operations Committee meeting. Yeah. Greg joined the university on November 11th. My goodness, that was barely a month ago, which is incredibly hard for me to believe given how much he has accomplished here in his first few weeks. As our Executive Vice President for Finance and Operations, Greg plays a critical role in driving long-term success of our university system. He's already demonstrated tremendous collaborative leadership and expertise, and those have been on full display since he arrived on campus, and I look forward to the many things that we will all accomplish together. I will have much more to say when I formally introduce Greg to the university community during tomorrow's board meeting. That concludes my remarks, Chair Hipsch. Thank you.
Thank you, President Cunningham. With that, let's turn to the first item on the agenda this afternoon, which is to discuss the variables and levers impacting budget planning for fiscal year 2026. I'd like to welcome Vice President Julie Tonneson to the presenters table. Before we turn to Vice President Tonneson, Executive Vice President Goldman, would you like to provide some framing comments?
Perfect. Thank you, Chair Hipps. This afternoon marks the first of 4 planned discussions as we work towards finalizing the fiscal year 26 budget. In September, October, the board reviewed and approved our biennial budget request to the state of Minnesota. While that request represents an important piece of our financial picture, it accounts for just 16% of our overall revenues. Now today, we'll shift our focus to the broader variables that shape the budget. Today's discussion will explore other key revenue sources and begin to outline areas where we anticipate expenditure growth in the coming fiscal year. I now turn it over to Vice President and Budget Director Julie Tonneson to guide us through this discussion. Julie?
Good afternoon, Chair Hipsch, members of the committee. As EVP Goldman just mentioned, there will be 4 opportunities for us to engage in a conversation about the FY26 budget. In some years, not this year, but in September and October of some years, we take an opportunity to meet with you to talk about and explain the university's internal budget process and the budget model we use to help you understand how we make our decisions. We didn't do that this fall, so I'm going to take an opportunity at the beginning of this presentation to hit some highlights of that before we move into the budget variables and levers for FY26. We will then get together again in February to talk in a more refined way about the budget variables for FY26 with more specific information and a modeling exercise, if you will. And then we will be before you in June 2 times for review and action on the budget. So those are the 4 FY26 times that we get together. The budget that we will bring to you, the recommended budget, will be an all funds budget. However, as we have discussed in the past, we really think about our funds in 2 different groups or categories. The first being what you see above the dark line here, the tuition and the O&M appropriation. Those are separated out because in large part they are planned at the institutional level. The president makes decisions and we ask you to make decisions that directly impact the level of revenue we receive from those sources. The other group, if I can make it a really large one, is what's below the dark line there, and that's all of the other revenues that we will talk about here this afternoon. But the distinction here is that they are primarily managed at the unit level based on the activities that our units are engaged in. So we don't you do approve fees and rates in the budget, but in large part, these funds are managed and determined at the unit level. So it's all about getting to step 1 and getting to a final budget recommended to you for June. So again, first I'm going to talk about the budget process, really to remind you about how we get to our recommendations, and then we're going to provide an overview of the revenue and expense variables to start thinking about the priorities for next year. In the process, we have a very distributed budget management model. That means that there are a lot of people involved. At the very top, the president is the one who makes decisions about some of the large variables for the budget, the direction, if you will, the guidelines for where we go with the budget. She has then delegated to what's called the budget committee, the budget process. The budget committee is myself as budget director, the executive vice president for finance and operations, the executive vice president and provost, and then the vice president for research, the vice president for equity and diversity, and the vice president for clinical academic affairs. And putting on our institutional hat, we take the direction from the president and turn those directions into budget instructions that we send out to our units every year. And we meet with every one of the 50 budgeting units of the institution every year to talk about their challenges and opportunities. The people that receive those budget instructions and have to respond to them and then to meet with us are the chancellors, the deans, and the vice presidents. This is the level we hold accountable for the financial activity that occurs within their units. How they involve their departments is their choice. They have all kinds of different processes in terms of how they build their budget response to us. They respond to us, we meet with them, we end up making, as a committee, recommendations to the president on all aspects of the budget. It becomes an iterative process back and forth until ultimately she decides on what to submit to you as her recommended budget, which you will then review and take action on in the spring. The timeline for this activity starts in the summer of an even-numbered year. And I say that because that's the point at which we have to build our biennial budget request to the state of Minnesota, and we can't do that in a vacuum, or at least it's not advisable to do that in a vacuum. So we don't just pull a number out of the sky. It's actually thought about in the context of all those other variables that we're dealing with. So all of the other revenues that we have available to us and the costs that we're facing. We build a very high-level, 30,000-foot look of incremental changes in revenues, incremental changes in expenses. The revenues have to exceed or equal the expenditures before we will bring it forward. But that black box, I'm going to call it that today, really starts the process. The state request as part of that black box is given then, after you approve it, to the state in October, which we just did a couple of months ago. The governor makes a recommendation. It's an early part of the process, and that should be happening in the next several weeks. And then it goes to the legislature, and hopefully by the end of May, we know what our appropriation will be for the next 2 years. That's the ideal. But simultaneously, while that state process is going on, we have to build our internal budget. And so that black box, the assumptions and plans in that black box, help us create the budget instructions that go to our support units in the fall, in September. We meet with them in October, November. We make preliminary decisions on their allocations about now in December. Then we start with the academic units in January, and that runs all the way through May until at the end, when we know what our appropriation is, we can bring it all together and create a balanced budget. The second year of the biennium, we don't have to go through the state process again. We sometimes choose to do that. We submit a supplemental request, but we don't have to because we have our appropriation. And then we have to do our internal process the same timeline that we did the prior year. We do tweak the black box because we have new information. We have new information on costs, we have new information on the state appropriation and so forth. So we will tweak it, but we don't have to start completely over. And then in the second year, the board reviews the budget in May and takes action in June. Now, to help us arrive at a comprehensive budget for this very complicated and complex organization, we need a tool to help us get from that 30,000-foot look at the budget, to get from that black box for the university down to meaningful discussions and conversations with our units. And to do that, we use a budget model tool. It's a responsibility center management, or RCM, budget process and a budget tool that doesn't make decisions, but it helps us get to a conversation at the unit level. And I'll explain that in more detail here in a minute. But the budget model itself is a set of decision rules and formulas and algorithms about how we attribute revenues and how we allocate costs. And in our model, the earned revenues that you see in the upper left-hand box there are attributed 100% to the academic RRCs, Resource Responsibility Centers of the institution. Those are the system campuses, each of the Twin Cities colleges, and some major centers, extension, and so forth. They earn those revenues based on the activities they are engaged in, and they get the revenues as they earn them. The state appropriation is not earned. It is given to us as an institution. So for that piece of it, we have an incremental budget process, a base plus minus process. So every one of those units has a base recurring level of state appropriation, and we decide each year how much to give them in terms of an increase or a decrease, depending on the situation we're dealing with. So in this model, 100% of the revenues are attributed to the academic RRCs, which means they have to have 100% of the costs. So they use that revenue to pay for their faculty, to pay for their equipment and their travel and so forth, their direct costs, but they also need to pay for their share of the institutional support costs, and that's what you see on the right. All of our support functions have their budgets in one of these 9 major cost pools that are charged out as a bill to our academic units every year. This set of decision rules does not make all the decisions, however. It's just a tool, which I hope this example will help everybody understand how this works and how it operates. This is the 3-legged stool of resource allocation, and on the bottom it starts with the decisions that the president makes in that black box I was referring to earlier. What are we going to do about compensation, about tuition? What are the costs that we know that are going up? What would we like to invest in? As well as what do we want to do with the state appropriation ask and so forth. Those high-level guiding decisions have to get turned into numbers, which is the second leg of the stool in the upper left. That's that black box budget framework, and it has to balance. But then we could stop there. I can't imagine it. It would be very, very hard to stop there because what we need to do is think about what is the impact of those decisions on our units and where it's actually implemented. And the budget model is the third leg of this stool because it helps us translate that black box high-level budget framework down to a unit level. So if we're going to increase tuition 2%, compensation 2%, and we want to invest in the libraries, the budget model is what helps us figure out what do those decisions mean when I'm looking at the College of Design. What does it mean? Well, how much tuition revenue are they going to generate? What is their compensation cost? What's their cost pool charge for the library investment? And if they want to invest in new faculty, do they get some of that and so forth? We create together a budget framework for each one of those operating units so we can see the impact of the high-level decisions because they each have different characteristics that lead to different challenges and different opportunities. And at the end, if those revenue increase, if that tuition revenue and the cuts we're asking them to do isn't enough to pay for their cost increases, we have to come in on the back end and make other decisions about, are we going to cut them deeper? Do we have state money increase that we can give to them? If we don't, are we going to move resources around? How are we going to solve that? And each one of those units has a different set of situations that give us a different framework. So the evidence of why that we have to do that is really on this chart, which you have seen before. But I think it's important to understand this is the level, as I mentioned, of the institution we hold accountable for the financial activity that occurs within it. These are the academic units. There's a similar list of support units. But these are the revenue-generating academic units. And they each have unique characteristics that matter for developing the budget. For example, you can obviously see they're different sizes. The medical school is it's over 1/6 of the university. It was $933 million on this chart, their budget. The experiment station is the smallest at $12 million. But you can also see that they all have state money. That's the green, the neon green on the left. So none of them operate totally without any state support. And I think most importantly, you can see the different dependencies on revenue that these units have, which brings different challenges and different opportunities. So if you look at those that are very dependent on tuition, you're looking at the College of Liberal Arts, the Duluth campus, the Carlson School of Management, for example. If something happens with enrollment that's unanticipated and negative, it has an immediate impact on their budget, and they have different outcomes and different actually solution options for that. Then if you look at the medical school, which is not as dependent on tuition, their enrollment has less ups and downs, but they're very dependent on sponsored research and grant activity. And so if something happens at the federal level that impacts their ability to get grants, that has a direct impact on them, which has no impact on the law school. So they're all very unique and different. And so it helps us, the budget model helps us talk about the budget impacts at this level so we can make the decisions that are best for each one of these units for every year. That different dependence on revenue shows up at the institutional level too, and this is a chart over time that shows how we have become as an institution less dependent on state revenue. You can see in 1990 we were 39% of our revenues came from the state of Minnesota. Today it is 16%, as was mentioned earlier. The tuition has gone from 12% to now we are sitting at 23% of our revenues. And all of our other revenues, which I will highlight here in a minute, what those are, we are now a strong majority of our revenues at 61%. They were 48%, now 61%, which is really hard to do. It's hard to grow that revenue. I've mentioned that before. I went and looked at exactly what has happened to some of the revenues within this time frame. And when you go all the way back, there's been pretty steady growth, I think, in 3 categories of other revenue. Our sponsored research, our grants, have actually in this 35-year time frame have gone up and down. There have been negative years, but most recently there has been more growth, as you saw earlier this morning in a presentation. But we've also had growth in sales income, pretty steady and regular, and growth in our philanthropy. Our gifts has been pretty regular and steady. So that's where we have seen the growth, and that is really a difficult thing to do. I do want to shift now to a focus, that's the highlight of the process and the overall budget. So I want to shift to a focus on the resource and expenditure variables for FY26 at a really high level. We will come back to this in February, but we'll start the conversation today with pointing out what some of the main variables are. And this is focused a lot on the state and tuition funds, but not solely, as you will see in a minute. So starting with the state appropriation, I won't go through the request. You know what it is, $235 million over the next 2 years, or 32%. We are modeling, however, scenarios of all different levels of state support. And I think it's important to keep in the forefront of our mind that if we get less than we requested or no state money in terms of an increase for our core mission needs, it means that we have to rely more on the other variables here, which is tuition and internal reallocation and budget cuts, or a delay or underinvestment in things. I mean, those are really the impacts we have for the core mission side. If we don't get the funding for the other 3 initiatives, it really means making some decisions, some hard decisions about what are the really critical priorities within those initiatives that we have to go forward with regardless. And how are we going to do that? And which of the pieces of those can we delay or underinvest in? But that's what it means if we don't get the state money. Moving to tuition, and where does it come from first? You can see here that on the Twin Cities campus, those who are paying the resident rate, the undergraduates, make up 39% of our projected tuition revenue this year. The Twin Cities graduate student tuition is responsible for 20% of the total, and then the professional Duluth and the Twin Cities undergraduate and R&R revenue are each in that 10 to 14% range. Crookston, Morris, and Rochester are small relative to the others in terms of tuition revenue. But tuition, as you know, at over $1 billion now is before waivers, is a very important revenue source for us that we really have to monitor. It can be volatile. So last year we started a process of looking at our tuition revenue earlier in the fiscal year to see what it was looking like based on fall registrations, and we continued that this fall. So what you see here is our estimate, all else being equal. If we just base it on the fall registrations, we will come out okay this year, 2.2% above budget on tuition, which is a good thing. But there are units, you can see the 2 system campuses here, and there are some colleges on the Twin Cities campus who are coming in below budget this year. What that means is for those that are down, we first work with them to identify why we think that's the case. And is it a one-time thing or an ongoing potential change in the base, so to speak? We don't know for sure, but we use the best information we can to make that determination. We talk with them right away about what are the available resources they have and the tools they have to handle that shortfall, because they have expenses that were going to be paid by this revenue that isn't there. So what kind of reserves do they have or ability to reduce expenses? And if it appears to be an ongoing thing, we're looking right away at what recurring expenses we can pull out right now to reset their budget. This year's outcome, so this FY25 outcome is important for next year, because where there's a surplus here, it means ongoing recurring revenue without recurring expense committed to it. That means we can spend it in next year's budget on recurring items. The opposite then becomes a cost. So if we're dealing with a unit that has a shortfall this year that's ongoing, that it means it's going to, it's not going to bounce back right away, we have to cover that expense in the FY26 budget. So what happens here does impact the FY26 budget. And then, of course, we do look at the growth potential for tuition revenue for next year. Right now, each 1% increase in the tuition rate across all of our populations would generate about $10 million. But beyond rate and the revenue that the rate generates, we also have other considerations. On the rate side, we look really at 2 different kinds of things. And that is, first, the comparison to other places, whether that be within our system or comparison to peer institutions for different purposes, market kind of considerations. And then we also look at the availability of financial aid across all of these categories of students. What's happening with the Pell Grant, what's happening with the state grant program, what's happening with our scholarship generation, and so forth. The availability of financial aid comes into the conversation. On the enrollment side, again, there are 2 different areas of consideration. One is retention. It's equally as important as landing that incoming class. We have to keep the students we have and help them be successful through to graduation. That has a revenue impact. Then we also look at potentials and plans for enrollment growth. So are we going to increase the non-resident population on the Twin Cities campus, for example? Where are we in Rochester's planned growth scenarios? And then, of course, for Crookston, Duluth, and Morris, we have been trying to stabilize and grow the enrollment as best we can above where they have been lately. So all those pieces come into play for next year's budget. The third primary resource variable is our internal reallocation, which is, as you know, our internal process of making decisions to stop spending on some things on a recurring basis in order to free up existing resources to spend on something else. And you can see here what we've done the last 10 years or so in this area. We have ranged on a dollar basis from $16.1 million in FY15 to almost $50 million of internal cuts in FY22. On a percentage basis, it's ranged from 0.8% this year to 2.5% in FY22, with many of these being right around 1%. Why do we have to do this? We have to do this because if you think about it, our tuition revenue is constrained, rightly so. We try to keep it down, but it is constrained, and tuition revenue does not pay for the fully allocated cost of instruction. Research grants and ICR combined do not pay for the fully allocated costs of research. The state money has not kept up with inflation, and costs go up every year. The math simply does not work with those constraints and those challenges unless we go in and reprioritize existing resources as well. And this doesn't just happen in tuition and state funds, it happens in all of our funds. If their revenue doesn't grow to cover their cost increases, they have to, in all those other funded areas, they have to cut expenses in order to make the budget balance. So we do have to reprioritize existing resources. And in those other funds, I keep talking about other funds, this is what I'm talking about. These are the major categories. This is critical and it's significant. $2.9 billion this year is what we are anticipating to get from these sources, which again is about 61% of our total. They are factored into the budget, they are monitored, they are estimated. But there are some nuances when you talk about these funds in terms of a budgeting exercise. First, we do incent our units to grow these revenues. I think that's evident. We have, they get to retain, I should say. They get to retain those resources as they grow. Sometimes they can take the place of the exercise I just mentioned. So if they grow enough, they won't have to make cuts. They have to grow them to cover their expenses. And it hopefully will keep us from needing to use state and tuition funds to help subsidize the activities funded by these other revenues. And then there are some challenges that we have to work through. We all do as we manage these funds. Many of them are restricted to a particular unit or a particular purpose, which means we can't move them wherever we want to. They're unequally generated. We have some units that are much more diverse in their ability to generate revenues than others. Some of them come with increased costs, and many of them are non-recurring. But they're very important. They're just challenging. Finally, I want to shift to expenditure variables for next year, and I want to start with a summary of the change in total expenditures over the last 10 years. In the maroon, you can see total expenditures for all non-sponsored funds combined, adjusted to 2014 dollars. So these are adjusted for inflation. And what this shows that even during years of expansion of scope, which we have been in, we have been controlling our spending because we have only grown over this time period 0.8% in FY24 compared to FY14, which is an average annual increase if you look at it across the years of zero, essentially. So we've been able to stay right at inflation even while we are expanding our growth. As a subset within that, we have the gold bars, which is the state and tuition dollars. And here, we have seen a decrease of 4.3% over the last 10 years, which is an average annual decline of 0.4%. And that is because there's less there. We've become more dependent on other revenues, but also we have been controlling spending in that area as well. Somewhat, this masks some of the costs that routinely exceed inflation. So we have certain areas of our budget, think healthcare, fringe benefits in some years, think lab supplies, think about public safety type expenses or utilities. There's certain areas that have seen more than inflationary kinds of increases. And in order to manage those within the budget, we use a lot of different tools other than revenue growth. We have the revenue growth option always, but we have a lot of tools we use and tactics and strategies to reduce expenses. And in any given year, units are looking at doing these kinds of things in order to manage and balance their budgets. The gold box represents the primary tactics that are part of PEAK, and it says PEAK Plus, because I don't want you to think that we're only looking at increased efficiencies and consolidation for the PEAK-related functions. We're actually doing that across all the functions of the institution in different ways and in different amounts and in different places. The unique circumstances each year by unit dictate which of these are the strategic and smart thing to do for each of those units, and they will differ. For the cost variables that are most pertinent for the FY26 budget planning, we have bundled them into these 5 categories, which we will mention briefly, each of them, starting with compensation, which is our largest budget variable each year. Right? This table shows you what we have provided for in a general wage inflation increase pool. That includes our labor contracts as well as all of our merit-based pay plans. And you can see that prior to the pandemic, in all but 1 year, our salary pool increased at or above the rate of inflation. all except FY18, and I don't remember what happened that year. But then the pandemic hit, and two things happened. We had extraordinary inflation, at least as compared to prior to that time period, and we were unable to provide raises for a couple years of any significance. Then, starting in 23, when the inflation maybe, hopefully, has started to regulate more, we have been providing increases higher than we had prior to the pandemic. So this has become something that we have to manage, but it's one of the major decisions we make in the budget every year. I do want to say this affects all funds. The dollar amounts you see here, the $15 million in FY15, for example, was the cost for our state and tuition funded positions. You can double that row essentially to get to the total cost across all of our funds. Beyond the annual merit pool and our bargaining contracts, we are facing some changes that are driving costs going forward related to compensation. And the first two lines of this gold box here really I think about as one piece, but we have a lot of market compression, equity, retention issues, and many of which were coming through the Senate's were expressed in the Senate's Workforce Reinvestment Resolution of pressures where we have certain targeted areas where we need to make some change. And then we have law changes. We have benefit changes that are coming related to leaves, and we have some, for example, the Paid Family Medical Leave Act. We have the safe and sick time things we have to implement, and we have some areas of minimum pay increases, minimum floors, minimum pay, dollars per hour, and so forth that we have to address. And those things impact all of our employee groups in one way or another. Some of them impact different groups differently, but to address those going forward will be millions of dollars on top of what was on the previous slide for the general wage pool increase. A second major cost variable isn't a surprise, and that is facilities. Our continued delay in funding increases for basic repairs on our facilities has really led to a bleak situation in which we're facing an annual needed increase of $200 million a year, roughly, just to keep from going backwards. I'm talking here about the operating budget, not HEAPR, not building renovation, major building renovation or renewal. This is things like a leaky roof and a cracked window and those kinds of things. We have been underinvesting, and we simply need some tactics and strategies that have to go into the budget going forward in order to get, I don't even want to stay on top of it, but just to start really addressing that in a strong way. And that is on top of the other facility costs that we have on a routine basis. Cost increases for facilities related to utilities, which looks like it's going up between 8 and 10% next year. We have debt service coming in on some major facilities next year. And all of those pieces that are routine are going up in that, I'm going to guess, $20 to $22 million range right now. Technology is another cost variable that we have every year, and that's particularly the infrastructure in two different ways. The vendor contracts, the vendor maintenance contracts, which go up every year in millions of dollars, as well as our security improvements, our data security and system security improvements that we need and want to make. Moving beyond those two infrastructure areas, we have compliance and safety, which I've bucketed together here. I literally have pages from the units of compliance-related activities that they have to address, and that is needing people primarily to understand them, to implement those compliance pieces and regulation, to maintain them and to report on them. It's a growing piece of our budget, and we obviously have safety. We have public safety concerns. We want to make permanent some of the improvements we've made recently in Dinkytown and other areas. We have lab safety issues, a lot of health and safety related costs. And then the last variable here is enrollment management. We have a desire to serve our students and to recruit our students. And so there are costs related to staying on top of their needs. their basic needs, their service needs, their career prep needs, and so forth. And we have costs related to attracting them. So we have marketing costs. We might have an expansion of services to attract them and so forth. We are working with our units right now to refine these last few categories here in terms of what is absolutely critical to go forward with, what would be the highest priorities. So that's part of our budget process and meeting with the units to understand those costs. But we know that they will exist. Between now and February, if you want to think about all this and sort of synthesize it, but either today or in February, we are very willing to hear your thoughts on priorities, on the resource side, on what kind of messaging is important to take to the state. What do you think about tuition rates going forward and enrollment plans? Are there other revenue opportunities that you might be aware of or want us to think about? On the cost side, what are the priorities related to compensation and workforce reinvestment? What is the priority and how should we implement changes in our deferred maintenance plans? We are going to have to cut budgets. So what are your thoughts on that, if you have any? And then, of course, any other priorities or thoughts that you would have that would help us in putting the budget together, we are more than happy to listen to and hear and take notes. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to stand for questions.
Thank you for a great presentation. Are there any questions or thoughts? Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Hibbs. One of the things you meant, thank you for the presentation. It's always important and I pay close attention and it's a good review. You mentioned expansion of scope and contributing to about, well, less than 1% add on to the budget.
Yeah.
And that's good. And I know we've expanded things like student services, mental health, health and safety, all those kind of things cost a lot of money.
Yep.
And we're going to have to reconcile for that. Is that expansion of scope more those kind of things? Because I don't think we've expanded academic scope in terms of program or like really blown up what we're offering.
Right, right. Mr. Chair, Regent Davenport, you've hit the one area I was going to mention for sure in terms of scope, and that is student services and student support functions, those kinds of things. But in addition, I would say the research expansion. We have, and you're right, we haven't added a college, we haven't added, a lot of departments. We do change program and so forth. But I think it's more in the research side. Our research footprint has grown, and that comes with cost.
Go ahead, Paula.
So I would hear that as looking at return on investment, which I think will come, but it might not come immediately.
Yeah, there are, Mr. Chair, Regent Davenport, there are many, many benefits to doing more research that others in the room are more qualified than I to explain. But clearly, there are benefits to research, and so, but it is an investment. I mean, it costs a lot of money to support the infrastructure and the bureaucracy and the compliance and all of the safety and all those pieces that go into it. That doesn't pay for itself, but it is extremely important and has benefits beyond the financial.
Go ahead, yep.
So you'll hear from me always, and everyone's tired of hearing me say, we can't cut without investing. We must invest, not just cut. When we look at deferred maintenance, technology costs, compensation pressures, mandates that we have, we are going to have to prioritize within the next few months our cuts and where we're going to invest.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Chair. Or thank you, Regent. Anybody else? I just, go ahead, Regent.
Just so I understand, there was a slide on our materials, it's page 14 of the materials, it's the bar chart that shows major academic units, actual fiscal year 23 revenues.
Yeah.
All right, and as I understand, the medical school is the biggest contributor to the revenues of our budget. Is that how I'm interpreting that, or correctly?
Mr. Chair, Regent Mayron, yes, the medical school is these are all total revenue generation, and so they are the largest within the system.
And so percentage-wise, just so I understand how big they are in terms of the entire budget.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Regent Mayron, I think the math I just did the other day was 18%.
That they contribute to the budget. Okay.
Thank you. I guess when you brought up that chart on the deferred maintenance, that's one of those charts that really scares the heck out of me, because if you don't fix the roofs now and they turn into big major expenses later, then you have to decide what are we going to do. And yet there's really not a lot of money to fix that stuff. And so, we're going to have to make hard decisions and reinvest money at some point, because I don't think the legislators are going to keep giving us heaper dollars. They just announced their budget, correct? I mean, or not their budget, but their forecast. Yeah. And it wasn't real sweet. So
Best.
Yep.
anyway.
Mr. Chair, members, I don't think I said it when I was going through the slides, but one of the black box framework items that we put in is investment, an investment pool. So it isn't just covering the costs that I outlined. We actually put in a placeholder for and a plan for increased investment. So investment in the facilities or investment in programs, services, that's part of the plan as part of that black box that we have to prioritize around and fund in one way or another.
Thank you. President Cunningham?
Yes, Chair Hipsch, and boy, it's late in the day, and Chair Regent Davenport, I need my coffee. I wondered if you could maybe speak to, understanding that that the math doesn't work, as you've said, and as you and I have realized together here, that the state forecast is not what anybody would like it to be, and that we're going to have to invest because one has to invest. The math on there leads to we have to not do some things. And do you want to talk a little bit about the scenario planning maybe that we've asked units to do?
I sure can.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, every year we give reallocation targets out to our units as part of a planning exercise for the upcoming budget. And this year we have actually it's a little bit different this year because we are giving targets out. We gave targets out to our support units in September, and they are responding to those now, and we're dealing with those now. And we have early given high target levels to our academic units to go through an exercise of potential scope reduction. So if you had to cut, and we actually gave them a percent of 7%, if you had to reduce your state and tuition budget by 7% and had to do so in a way that wasn't so opportunistic. I mean, at that level, it's hard to be opportunistic. You have to make some really tough decisions. What would those options be? What would those plans be? So it's not something that we have done in the same way in the past, and but we are prepared to have some really difficult conversations about what we may or may not go forward with from those plans. And that will be part of this next phase of the process from January to May, where we will be talking about those potential options.
If I may, and the reason I say that is certainly not to worry our units or to worry our community, but however, if we are collectively going to be fiscally responsible, and we may or may not get state funds, and yet, you all have charged me to continue to make our university great and better, and for us to do that with our community, then collectively we're going to have to look at how we do this, and we need our units to participate in that thinking. This is just scenario planning, but we are doing hard scenario planning across those units of not what you would do around the edges with 1%, but what would we do if we really had to make adjustments? What is your highest priority? How would we focus forward? We maybe won't have to do any of those. We maybe will have to do some. Let's see what we get from our state budget request. But I just want you folks to hear that we're also living in reality, which is we have to be able to manage our financial destiny, and we have to be able to do that with the funds that we have, not the funds that we hope somebody will maybe give us that maybe will not. And even if we get the state funds that we need, if we want to address the things that have not been funded in our budget before, like our operational, our deferred maintenance, which have not been accounted for in the past in our operational budget in years at all. If we're going to start to put those things in that need to be in there, then we're going to have to think about this scenario planning. And so other reason, as that trickles out, you may hear also then that, we're being asked to think about, cutting our most amazing thing that is really special to us. And I understand that. And everything is beloved somewhere in the units. But the reality is we have to allocate the funds that we have. And so we are asking the units to do hard thinking about scenario planning about what that would look like if they had to reallocate funds and get, in this case, 7% less. It might not be 7%. It might be less. It might be lots of different things. But it's time to have those very grown-up conversations across our university about how we will continue to be great and invest on the things we have to do while also working with a budget that we have to balance.
Thank you.
And we will need your support for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Regent Wheeler.
No, I'm going to bridge off that. I think that's hugely important to do that scenario planning, because my question related was, with so many things at risk of failure that we have in the system, what is our flexibility that's embedded in this? What's our contingency? How do we approach that? And perhaps that's partial or the whole answer to it, but I wonder if there's more.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, Regent Wheeler, I would say that's a big portion of it. The other valves are all around not investing as much in the past. That isn't always a good choice, but that's really the only other valve we have.
Okay, thank you.
And the other revenues, I should say, the growth in the other revenues can, on the margin, help us in certain places with some of the expense growth that would have occurred on the tuition and O&M side. If that revenue is growing beyond the cost growth in that area and they can shift some of the O&M and tuition expenses over there, that does help, but that's isolated. I don't want you to think we don't think about that. We do. How can the growth in those other revenues help us? And we do, and we factor that in on unit by unit, but it isn't universally available, and it's on the margin. It's not enough.
Thank you.
If I may, Regent Wheeler, is some of those revenues, as were mentioned, in addition to philanthropy and things, are the research. And we heard this morning, without investment there, that will actually, so there's been already an underinvestment for a bunch of years that has led us to this place, right? And so we're going to have to invest. And the same thing, the building underinvestment has to make the budgets work. I mean, we haven't invested in those buildings. That was conscious choices for us a number of years, but now we're going to have to invest into some of them. So not investing is not really an option. We can't not invest in some of these student services. You heard the last folks around our mental health work with our students, et cetera. So some of this we have to invest in. That's going to have to come from somewhere. And we have to think about that collectively.
Makes sense.
Thank you. And I thank you all. So we'll move on to the next thing on our agenda.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, the next item is review of the campus plan for the Crookston campus. Here to present the draft plan are Chancellor Mary Holtz-Claus, Director of Planning Monique McKenzie, and Chief Sustainability Officer Shane Steffes. First, Executive Vice President Goldman, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you, Chair Hips. In 2020, university leadership initiated a comprehensive effort to create an integrated and cohesive set of campus plans to guide the future of each of our campuses. These plans address physical changes, align with university climate action commitments, and support the Board of Regents' mandate to plan for growth, capital renewal, and meaningful engagement with surrounding communities. Today, we'll review the Crookston Plan, which started last February and concluded in September 2024. This plan reflects Crookston's strategic vision for modest growth over the next 5 years, focusing on enrollment expansion for both online, full and hybrid, and in-person students. As a longstanding presence in the region, the Crookston campus, paired with the Northwest Research and Outreach Center, continues its historic legacy of advancing agriculture education and applied research, particularly in the areas like sugar beet production. The Crookston campus plan will return to this committee for action at a future meeting consistent with board policy. I will note that while the board retains the authority to approve the campus plan, climate action plans follow a different process requiring review by the board and approval by the president. I'll now turn over to Chancellor Mary Holtzclaws, Director of Planning Monique McKenzie, and Chief Sustainability Officer Shane Stenless. Thank you.
Chair Hipsch, members of the committee, we are pleased to be here today, very pleased to be here today and represent the work of many. This process started in October of 2023. We are 3 of 4. We are marching our way through the system and learning a lot at each location we're at. With that, I think I'll just ask Chancellor Holtzclaws to begin for us.
Chair Hipps and members of the committee, it's my distinct pleasure to present to you the proposed campus climate and action plan for your review. We'll be presenting this information today for your thoughts and approval or rejection in our February meeting. As Abraham Lincoln said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. It is with that philosophical approach that we embark upon this planning process. With my partners sitting here at the table and their talented teams, we began a deep dive into understanding how the campus currently utilizes its assets, but more importantly, what the future needs will be. Through an engaging process with community members, faculty and staff, and students, many ideas were explored. Some of the conversations highlighted challenges, while others presented great opportunities for the campus.
Chair Hipsch, members of the committee, as EVP Goldman and the Chancellor noted in their remarks, we are undertaking this campus and climate planning to create a vision for the future where the campus expects to be and be intentional in how that future unfolds. Both these planning activities were called for in the university's strategic plan, and they also implement board policy. And at many other higher ed institutions, campus and climate plans would be developed as separate activities. But we've decided to take a different approach, one that we've been told by our consulting teams and others is really innovative and really insightful, that developing these plans concurrently in a coordinated fashion brings us additional advantages and insights. Doing so results in synergies in the process of plan development. We can include unified principles around planning. We're efficient in engagement of the stakeholders, and it helps align our decision-making. It also results in aligned and reinforcing outcomes. For example, climate strategies may require land use that the campus plan then has to account for and take in. And similarly, the campus plan may drive activities that the climate plan needs to respond to. Now I'll turn it back over to Director McKenzie to take us from here.
I just want to provide a little geographic context for Crookston, and I know that most of you have visited Crookston, but it's an interesting part of our state. The University of Minnesota Crookston is located in a city of about 7,500 people, Crookston, but it's one of many post-secondary options in the northwest quadrant of our state, and that makes a big difference to the programs that are offered and the scale and the experience students have on our campus. So this map is giving you a sense of big cities close by, Grand Forks, other big cities, maybe not so close, but within reach, Fargo-Moorhead. And all of these things really factor into the spirit of Crookston and how Crookston casts its vision for the future. This campus is also located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples. The nearest tribal nations are Red Lake and White Earth. Those folks are also a very important part, of course, of the community in Northwest Minnesota. Crookston as a campus comes from the state's early commitment to learning on agriculture and natural resource science. Starting as early as 1895, there was an agricultural experiments research station at the site. 10 years after that, a residential high school was established, really to teach applied agricultural technology to farming families of the region. From the 1960s onwards, Crookston began a path towards first a 2-year and then a 4-year institution. Additional buildings, advanced learning, residential housing, as well as athletic facilities started to show up on the campus by approximately the 1990s. There's more detail about the history of this campus on page 52 of the plan document. So when you look at this view today, this is an aerial view. Federal Highway 2 is on the left of your screen. That'll take you all the way to the west if you are so inclined. Really what you can see in this perspective is the original campus is clustered on the northern part of this image, so the upper part of the image. Some of those buildings date back to the 20s. The commercial presence of the city of Crookston is located south of campus. It is a long, often cold, walk to town. So this campus is not embedded in the city or really in a surrounding city neighborhood. However, the lands to the east and north are the Northwest Rock, as Executive Vice President Goldman noted. So that Northwest Rock operations, that focus on cropping systems, whether it's small grains or sugar beets, pest and pathogen management, emerging agronomic practice is really embedded, again, in the spirit of the Crookston campus. Over time, this campus has evolved so that many buildings are now connected together. Once you make it to the buildings, you have a comfortable, connected experience. But because your residential life is quite different than your academic life, sometimes it's quite a haul to get up to the north side of campus. So now we've taken that aerial view, we've turned it on its side, so Highway 2 is at the bottom of your image here, and we're just diagramming for you how daily life goes on the Crookston campus, again, in the interests of you understanding where this vision for the future comes from. The cluster of pink at the upper left represents the student center. So there are study spaces there for individual and group study, student services, the dining hall is located there. Most academic spaces are connected to that student center. So this is what I mean about the interconnectedness of the campus. Housing is located in the cluster of yellow buildings to the right of that diagram. There are hubs within those buildings, they show in pink there. And really that's where students gather if they're not at class or they're not moving to and from dining. The Recreation and Sports Center you see in the middle of the diagram, also with a pink halo around it, is really a focal point and a gathering place for campus life at Crookston. It's worth noting that Crookston has a higher percentage of student athletes than any other UMN campuses. In fall of 2024, 42% of the enrolled students on campus at Crookston were registered on one of the campus teams. So the Rec Sports Center in the pink hub is really the focal point for those student athletes who are training almost daily, and of course many other students too. So with the academics at the left side of your diagram, north end of campus, housing and residential student life on the right, there's a lot of going and coming. So that means the Crookston students every day earn their hardiness, particularly in cold conditions like this. I'll ask Shane to take us back to some of our other current conditions of influencing our plan.
So when we're thinking about climate planning, we're focused on two primary objectives, as we've talked about before. One is how do we eliminate the carbon pollution that contributes to climate change? And then secondly, how do we make the campus more resilient to climate change's impacts as a place-based institution? In order to address these planning outcomes, obviously we need to know where those emissions come from. On the pie chart on the left shows you a breakdown of emissions from the campus from fiscal 23. As you can see, on-site combustion, or basically the steam plant for the campus, contributes over 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions and pollution that is created that contributes to climate change. This is primarily due to the fact that the plant continues to run on coal as its primary fuel source. And is a key focus of the planning activity we'll talk with you about in a little bit. Purchased electricity is another large source. The campus gets all of its electricity from the local utility provider, Otter Tail Power, and that comprises almost 30% of the total emissions for the campus. We expect that this number will decrease over time, though, because the state of Minnesota a session ago passed a law to have utilities provide 100% clean energy by 2040. So we expect that the Otter Tail utility will, as they comply with that law, be addressing those emissions. The other piece of the puzzle is obviously to prepare campus for the impact of climate change, and so we need to know where the climate is headed, and that is the image on the right. Based on modeling from university researchers, what that image reflects, we expect that the campus will likely experience more extremely hot days, fewer days below freezing or with snow cover, and a change in seasonal precipitation with wetter springs, drier summers, heavier rain events, and longer dry spells without measurable rainfall. The planning activities that we've undertaken over the course of the last several months are addressing all of these dynamics. I will turn it back over to Director McKenzie to take us from here.
I'll just spend a few minutes talking about some of the factors that really shape these plans. And we begin, of course, with enrollment. So you see in the graphic here a depiction of information that you discussed at Regents in May of 24, I believe it was, regarding strategic enrollment. So the gray line represents the total enrollment at Crookston, the yellow line represents the online population, and the maroon line indicates the in-person students. So today we're thinking about a population of approximately 700. It was dated data in May of 24. And our target in terms of on-campus presence is about 850. So that factor of growth, which we anticipate in terms of on-campus student presence, really trails into everything else, facilities, student life, et cetera. So I wanted to touch that briefly, and then I'll go through as a reminder. And again, all of this is extended in the plan document in case you caught it as you were running through it. The list of drivers here are really an indicator to you of the comprehensive approach we take to understanding the future forces that will influence all of our campuses. And we start with a similar list, right, at each campus. Certain qualities, certain factors really elevate and customize the specific recommendations we arrive at for each campus, beginning, of course, with enrollment. To the next slide, really engagement is a critical part of the work we do with all of these plans. That's partly in response to the Regents' approved campus planning principles, which direct us to create inclusive, accountable planning and implementation process. So in that effort, we use a number of different methods to reach people where they are, to solicit through digital surveys, mapping techniques, conversations, tabling, walk-bys. We've been known to resort to candy to try to entice students to talk to us. Sometimes it works. So really, we're highly committed to this. It means that we're on the ground. Being on the ground is really important. And we also draw on networks established. So advisory committees appointed by chancellors are a good example of that. The principles then that you see here are a tool that we have crafted as we do this planning work because we recognize we cannot possibly anticipate every future that will arrive at our doorstep. So these principles represent the values and aspirations for each of the specific campuses. They change every time we do a new campus plan. They respond to those drivers I mentioned earlier, and they shape current thinking today about the future, best as we can represent it, and they'll complement the recommendations that you'll see I'm about to discuss in our big ideas. So for Crookston, we have encapsulated or captured sort of the easiest way to remember the transformation we're talking about. And I don't mean you won't recognize it. I just mean we want to sort of consolidate into big ideas for the future of this place. And we discuss it in these ways. So we begin with talking about modernizing and reinvesting in the campus. And based on the facility condition of our facilities at Crookston, multiple buildings need significant reinvestment to support advanced learning, to support student spaces, to address our sustainability goals, even things like energy retrofits in buildings, and of course, as you heard in your budget discussion, deferred maintenance. We believe there's an opportunity to look more closely at how space is used so that we can achieve better utilization. The second big idea that we have here is really about the quads. So on our campus, we have three primary quads, the more original quad, a student life quad, which is really clustered around housing, and then a learning quad, which is just to the east. And quads are formed, of course, by buildings, but how do we use those quads? How do we plant those quads? How do we make sure we can do outdoor learning, for example, in those quads? The third big idea is about the working landscape, and this is a fascinating image you see on the left. This picture was taken approximately 1933, we think, by someone who was brave enough to go up in an airplane. And what's fantastic about it is it shows this landscape quality that we're seeking to restore to Crookston. So you see the heavily planted perimeter of our campus to the north and west. That's where the prevailing winds come from. So in order to break the winds, in order to create shade in the summer, this incredible commitment was made. Well, over time, due to storms and disease, these windbreaks were diminished. So creating a more amplified landscape, it brings us so many benefits. It allows for learning opportunities. It's a long play, carbon sequestration. It's one of our preferred transformations, if you will, that won't take tens of millions of capital dollars. The fourth big idea is about campus connections and gateways. And in a small campus, again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we're really calling out, again, an experience that can be a pedestrian on foot learning experience, a circuit, for example, walking around the campus through this restored windbreak, through other parts of the campus, interpretive signage, learning as you go, right? And it's a short season, but it's a glorious season. So being able to be outdoors and to do that is very important. I think the fifth big idea I wanted to discuss here was really about reimagining space for athletics. Student athletics are important to the culture of the campus. I mentioned earlier the participation rate. That 42% is about 275 students. On a small campus, it's fairly significant. In support of these athletes, there's a few different sort of tiers of investment we're proposing for athletics. One is a repair and addition to the existing sports center, which is heavily used by all the teams today. The second is to reinvest in the athletic fields. In that earlier diagram, you saw a whole bunch of fields to the right side of the diagram on the south. Some of those fields need renovation as the team needs change. And then the third, as we approach that future horizon in terms of the target enrollment, to create an indoor field house, which would support more athletic teams, more enrollment, but would also support existing teams' needs who require practice space outside of the frozen field season. So that's really a summary of the big ideas. Chancellor Murray, when she wraps, will give you the overall image of it, and I'm going to turn it back to Shane to point us towards the climate action elements of these plans.
So relative to our climate mitigation or our prevention step, what we're really aiming to do here is reduce by 2034 emissions 54% on the campus. We're principally going to accomplish this by repowering the existing steam district energy facility with a fully electrified option, and then powering that or providing that electricity that supplies that facility with more and more renewable electricity as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner over time. Electrification is also a major component in reducing the emissions from fleet and commuting, given the geography and the rural context of Crookston. So many people drive to and from campus, whether they're employees coming to work or they're students that are commuting from off-campus housing. And so, being able to facilitate that electrification of their vehicles is really critical. Longer term, the campus will advance to carbon neutrality by 2050. This will rely on the local utility meeting their commitments under the 2040 Clean Energy Carbon-Free Law in the state of Minnesota, and that will continue to advance transportation decarbonization. But for sectors like commuting and air travel, when we get into the more difficult to abate or mitigate emissions, we're going to have to look toward carbon offsets as a small portion of our approach potentially. In terms of preparing for the impacts of climate change, UMC is going to advance resiliency along 3 dimensions: community, environment, and infrastructure. On this slide, we listed some of the activities and initiatives that we intend to undertake in order to advance resilience for the campus in these areas. Some of these solutions also have extended benefits, which we love to see, and I think has a really important role to play in building partnerships with the region and beyond. So things like climate solutions for Northwest Minnesota and efforts to build greater grid resiliency and redundancy, they have benefits for both the city and the regional economy as well. This is a map that lays out visually some of these strategies and approaches that we're talking about in terms of the climate action plan. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them for you. If you look on the left side of the image, that red box that talks about thermal storage, or is pointed to as thermal storage, that's the approximate location of our existing steam plant, that's run and fueled with coal and propane. As I mentioned, we're planning to electrify that facility, so we would be using a mix of electric boilers and high temperature thermal energy storage to provide the steam and energy to heat campus buildings. As others have alluded to humorously, sometimes it's a cold place, right? And so from a ratio of cooling load to heating load, it is 8 times or more the heating load versus the cooling load. So heating is really critical to keep the building occupants and the research and the teaching safe and functional and everyone comfortable. This is a really innovative approach. We are not deploying this at other campuses, but we think that this really fits Crookston's context, and that high temperature thermal storage will provide a great deal of resiliency to the campus in the event of a potential electric grid disruption. It also prepares us to take advantage of excess renewable energy that might be on the grid that we can then use to power those facilities at lower cost, which is a fantastic advantage to give us. And then finally, because this is taking an approach that actually is going to be applicable for other industries and sectors, think about high temperature industrial processes. This is the same kind of approach that they're looking to use. We have a platform then to do demonstration and research for other industries in the region and in the area, which is really impactful. From there, I'm going to move you across to the other side of the map where you see solar arrays projected or shown both in dark blue and light blue. The light blue is meant to represent, potential capacity that we could build, locations that are options for building out solar on the campus as our needs evolve. But our primary focus in the near term is going to be on that chunk in the upper right-hand corner about a solar array installation around 1 megawatt in size. That is driven a little bit by regulatory process. So in Minnesota, there's a net metering cap, which is more technical than we need to get into today. And it's right at 1 megawatt. So we're really targeting something that meets that need or runs up right up to that need and that limit. But certainly we can explore other opportunities as the potential arises and in conversation with the utility in the region. And then finally, I'll just point down to the windbreaks, which Director McKenzie had mentioned earlier. really around planting climate resilient trees and reestablishing those windbreaks to not only provide comfort and energy savings, but also to think about how do we connect this to the academic mission. So we're actually already in conversation with the Sustainability Office and faculty on the Crookston campus about how we connect this to the forestry curriculum and experiences for students on campus, and use this as a learning opportunity, an applied learning experience, while we're also advancing our operational goals about reestablishing this windbreak. I'm going to turn it back over to the Chancellor to finish this off. Thanks.
So in summary, in the near term, we will need some major and some lesser renovations in our teaching, learning, and administrative spaces, particularly in Hill Hall, which you can see here, UTALK, the University Outreach Center, Selvig, and Dowell Hall. And so most of you I know have viewed our primary athletic facility, the Lee Secker Gymnasium. I think we showed you all the fact that it has some structural issues which need attention. And then we're also in need of additional locker rooms and other team spaces. The current weight room is not adequate for our 240 plus athletes. So near term, we recognize that we must take actions. The good news is many of our residential halls are in excellent shape because most of them are quite new. In fact, most years, the University of Minnesota Crookston is voted as the best residential facilities in the state of Minnesota on campuses. And our indications show that we will have modest growth and will need additional housing to accommodate those students who want to be on campus. So in order to do that, we need to renovate McCall Hall, which is a facility that was built in 1941. It's structurally sound, and we're currently using just the first floor of that. This is one where we actually had taken some situations where we improved the windows. In the process of doing that, we ran into moisture issues, and so we had to not use the facility for a while until we were to really accommodate that and figure out what was going on there. So currently, we're just using one floor, but we recognize that we're going to need additional room. And so next year, we're in the process of getting ready, the second floor of the residential facility. This will require some innovation and some renovation. And so again, we're looking at that in the short term. As it's been alluded to, it's a cold climate. It is not easy to be a tree in Northwest Minnesota. So our harsh winters and strong winds, as we talked, has really killed a number of trees each year. So as Shane had said, we're going to embark immediately upon starting to plant some of those trees and really looking at trees that are indigenous to the area. That was a problem too, that some of them were not, that were put in the 30s. So we're going to be utilizing those tree species native to the area. Unfortunately, we also have a lot of ash trees on our campus. And so we're embarking upon, as we've watched the emerald ash borer make its way north, it's almost in our area. So we recognize that tree replacement is something that we can and will begin immediately this coming spring. So, and then lastly, as Shana had also alluded to, in the near-term horizon, we hope that you as our regents, when you come to visit us, will not be touring our 85-year-old heating plant dungeon, but instead it is our hope and our priority to find a source of funding to warm our campus with our new electric-powered steam plant with thermal energy storage. With that. And then in the long term, we need to right-size our campus and create better space alignments to support our students, our staff, and administrative needs. As our campus evolves, it may be possible to take down some facilities that are no longer needed, and this will certainly help our sustainability. And this will allow us, as I said, to be responsive to our sustainability footprint. For instance, Hill Hall, which was built in 1958, may have to be removed if our academic needs can be met elsewhere, and then we through that process. So many of the climatic conditions, it's increasingly difficult, as we've alluded to be competitive when our athletics and our teams are competing against universities that have indoor practice and multi-purpose facilities. Of the 16 teams that are a member of the Division II NSIC, we're the only campus that doesn't have a field house or a large indoor practice and competition area. We're also probably one of the most northerly universities in our league. So our longer-term horizon also forecasts need for additional housing facilities. We'd like to add an addition to McCall Hall to match demand and consider building new energy-efficient housing, given Skyberg, which is a 1960s facility, and its condition. If new housing can be constructed near Heritage, which is on the outside of the campus, we would remove Skyberg Hall. We would continue restoration and extension of the windbreaks, as we've said. So these recommended actions are based upon what we know today and are intended to be a resource when future issues require other decisions. So this concludes our formal presentation, and we'd stand and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, we have Regent Ruth Johnson.
First, thank you again, all of you, for the great presentation. I'm so glad we've had, as part of our onboarding, the chance to be on the campus, and we look forward to doing that again to give us a better sense of what's going on. Just as one small comment, but when you first showed the picture of the campus with the north and the west, trees, it reminded me of something I've been talking about with a few others recently for other reasons, but that is that for decades, for a long time, in rural areas in this part of the country, they had shelter belts, right? That's what they call them, shelter belts. They had trees on the windward side to protect crops and animals and all that from the fierce wind and some of the cold and that. It seems like that would be an idea. Obviously, I'm sure you're thinking about that, but also then tying in with forestry, finding the right trees and the right things that are indigenous to that. But it's kind of cool because it's kind of an old idea that then was people at a different period in agriculture, they took them all down, and then there were, chopped the trees down, and then, that wasn't a very good move. So anyway, I'll look forward to seeing what happens with that.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. And a lot of those were taken down because oftentimes they only use one species, and that would become diseased. And so I said, now we're looking, as you noted, on the native species and a multiple of species.
Thank you. Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Hips. Thank you for the presentation. And, I too was fascinated to go back between the old picture and then the plans and that. That was enlightening. My question is, could you remind me, someone, how we fund the athletic facilities and residence halls? Because students look for that, and that's top on recruitment. And students, you can correct me if I'm wrong, are interested in having more of a modern residence, and so are willing to pay for what they want in that sense. And so I think it's separate from the regular bonding process.
Regent Davenport, thank you for your question. The residence facilities are funded through an auxiliary budget, and then those are put usually on a 20 to 30 year payback period, and so that we're paying back the debt on those and able to generate income, obviously, from the students' residential life periods. The wellness center that we have on campus was built in 2016, and that was funded through central funds as well as long-term investments, which we pay back towards that every year. I don't believe there were any HEAPR funds that were used for that. That was before I came, but.
Chair Hibbs, Chancellor Mary, the Wellness Center was actually a state request, so 2/3 of the cost of the project came from the state, but the 1/3 cost is financed exactly as Chancellor Mary just described.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to say, Chair Hipshin and Regent Davenport, currently we're looking at trying to see what our bonding capacities are and what our loan and repayment capacities are, but we're quite committed to probably about 2027 to 2028 before we could actually, right now, be able to handle some of that additional debt.
Regent Turner.
Thank you, Chair Epps. When are you expecting to start working on the heating system?
Chair Hipsch, Regent Turner, I think that that's still to be determined in terms of we're looking for how would we resource it. So right now, every campus in the university system is going through a more detailed energy and utility planning study to detail out the specific phasing of construction projects and needs relative to both the climate plan and the campus plan. And that will inform sort of the timing around how do we develop out, specific projects within those plans, including things like the heating plant. You may recall too that the HEAPR request that we're making to the legislature this session also includes money to invest in maintenance of the bulk and the balance of the system at Crookston. So things like the steam distribution system and other components in the plant that are like ancillary equipment or support equipment for the operation of the district energy facility as well.
So, follow up. So you all have given up the idea about just repurposing that coal, kind of, I mean, making that more efficient, but still burning coal? Because I know that the Senate bonding wasn't too thrilled about that idea.
Chair Hips, Regent Turner. So the investment that we had have identified in the HEPR request is for the existing district energy facility that includes all the distribution piping and systems within both the plant and across the campus. Those investments are compatible with the future that we've described here in the plan. So the plan would actually build off of those investments. Okay. So those are not mutually exclusive. So we're still intending, and we still have, as part of our HEPR request, money in there to invest in the existing district energy facility at Crookston, and those investments would be compatible with this direction and path that we've outlined for you today.
Okay.
Thank you. I think one of the things that has to be said that hasn't been said is how important Crookston is to the community. You know, in Minneapolis here, we have the convention center, we have US Bank Stadium, we have all kinds of places to go. I've been to many functions at the student center for things like housing and agriculture and different other stuff that's only held there, and I'm 100 miles away. So it's really important, and part of our mission is also extension. And so I know Crookston plays a big part of that in the local community up there, and I think we can't underestimate the fact to have our public engagement with some of these rural campuses in the region to attract even people into the Twin Cities, but also they're very important to those regions. So anyone comment on that, Mary?
Thank you for your comments, Chair Hipsch. And we always try to work towards those private, public-private partnerships, as well as community and university partnerships. So for instance, the place where our Crookston sports facility is owned by the city, and that's where our hockey team plays. And likewise, our community uses the Crookston University facilities for a number of different things. We have basketball tournaments, and students are there. Between now and the I was going to say the beginning of the year, it will be full of young 7th and 8th grade students and young people who will be using that for their tournaments. So it is very much a symbiotic relationship between the community and the campus.
I think that's true with all of our rural campuses, and I'm very proud of that we share our resources with everybody. So thank you for that. Student Sturm.
Yes, thank you, Chair Hipsch. And thank you for your presentation and also the emphasis on the climate impact during construction, because I think for a really long time students have been hoping for more of a climate emphasis on things like this. So personally, as someone who works in student advocacy, I really appreciate it. And my question kind of in line with that is I love the effort to lean away from a coal source from heating. But my question would be, through that transition of switching away from coal to an electric model, would there be consistent heating throughout that whole period while students are continuing to go to school and live in residence halls? And what would the transition period for that look like? And would there be another way to make sure that comfort is maintained for everybody throughout that time and it doesn't impact students too much while they're going through the school process?
Chair Hips, Representative Sturm, yeah, absolutely. When we plan and implement a project like that, we're always ensuring continuity and reliability of the heating supply to campus buildings, so there's no disruption or impairment of that, because as you've noted and as others have noted, being a cold climate, it's not just purely about comfort, but it's also about safety, right? And so we have to make sure that students are safe, faculty are safe, we're in buildings, and so that heat supply is continuous throughout the construction process. So we would sequence and stage whatever construction we did in that regard to account for that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, presenters. We're going to move on to the next item. Thanks a lot. Okay, our next item is the consent report. Executive Vice President Goldman, will you summarize the items in today's report?
Thank you, Chair Heaps, members of the committee. December's consent agenda includes several items for your consideration. First, we have one purchase that meets the threshold for board approval, an $8.6 million 10-year contract with Pacquion LLC for ticketing software and services for the Department of Intercollegiate Athletics on the Twin Cities campus. This is funded through athletics ticketing services operating budget. Next, we seek approval to amend 3 of the defined contribution retirement plans established and sponsored by the university: the faculty retirement plan, the optional retirement plan, and the 457 deferred compensation plan. These amendments will adopt specific provisions of the federal Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Secure 2.0 Act and the Eligible Pay Amendment. We also seek to approve of changes to the civil service employment rules in accordance with board policy. We seek approval of a capital budget amendment for the Community University Health Center, or CUC. This clinic serves as a cornerstone in the mission for delivery of transformational care education to our community. The current clinic, however, has surpassed its useful life with significant deficiencies in safety, privacy, capacity that limits its ability to meet the growing needs of the community. The new state-of-the-art facility will provide a larger, more functional space designed to enhance patient, family, and student experience while fostering community engagement. The $45 million project, funded through donor contributions, UCare settlement funds, and debt paid for with budgeted funds from CUC operations, is planned to be completed in 2027. Also, as noted in the docket materials, the consent report I just outlined comes with presidential recommendations. The next 2 items related to East Cliff come with Board Mayoron's recommendations. The first item is the approval of a capital budget amendment for the renovation of East Cliff, the historic residence of the University of Minnesota's president. The project implements recommendations from the East Cliff Property Task Force, which were approved by the Board of Regents in July 2024. The $6 million renovation, fully funded by philanthropic contributions, addresses critical infrastructure and facility deficiencies, security, accessibility, and energy efficiency. Construction is set for substantial completion by 2025. The second item is for an approval of an amendment to the lease agreement with the state of Minnesota for East Cliff, extending the lease term by 2 months to February of 2025 to accommodate the ongoing renovation of the governor's residence. The agreement continues to utilize East Cliff as a public asset for a public purpose during the university presidential transition, with lease costs covering maintenance and reduced operating expenses. That concludes my remarks of the consent items, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now, before I invite a motion to approve the consent report, you are welcome to ask questions, make comments, or ask for an item to be separated out from the report to be voted on separately. Are there any questions, comments, or requests to separate an item out? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve on behalf of the board the consent report?
Move to approve.
And a second?
Second.
Second, okay. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. The motion is approved. Okay. Finally, that brings us to informational items. Executive Vice President Goldman, anything to highlight?
Chair Hips, members of the committee, our information items contain a few topics for today that I'd like to spend a few minutes highlighting. First, the fiscal year 2024 annual financial report provides a comprehensive overview of the university's financial position and operations, with comparative data for fiscal 2023. Issued with an unmodified or clean independent auditor's report by Clifton Larson Allen, the report includes highlights on assets, liabilities, revenues, and expenses, along with detailed analysis of significant year-over-year fluctuations. I'm pleased to report the university's balance sheet, income statement, and cash flows remain strong, as we expected from an AA1 rated institution. Next, the 2024 annual security and fire life safety reports for each of the campuses produced by our University Clary Compliance Director in the Office of General Counsel in compliance with the Clary Act. It provides 3 years of crime statistics and detailed reporting procedures, prevention programs, and available resources for addressing crimes. These reports highlight the university's continued commitment to safety and education across all of our campuses. Third, we've made substantial progress on the key finance and operations initiatives as outlined in MPAC 2025 system-wide strategic plan. Through our innovative financing strategies, such as long-term capital finance program, we have funded over $43 million in critical capital improvements and the university secured $19.3 million in debt service savings over the next 20 years by refinancing $170.25 million of outstanding debt to lower interest rates during fiscal 2024. We have advanced our enterprise risk management program by implementing a governance structure, completing pilot risk assessments, and launching a website. Ongoing safety planning across all campuses continues to align with MPACT 2025's goals of fostering safe, inclusive environments. And our land grant acquisition and use strategy plan and climate action plans are progressing, including an integration of guiding principles for property use and sustainability. Together, the team's strategic work over the year continued to drive on the university's commitment to fiscal stewardship and operational excellence. Finally, I'd like to mention that state law requires the university to submit a report to the legislature as part of our biannual budget process. The report in your docket materials includes information and data on University of Minnesota expenditures, revenues, state appropriations, tuition rates, graduation rates, research, consulting contracts, student demographics, and student debt data. This concludes my remarks and information items. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and welcome again. Okay, any questions? Okay, hearing none, we are now adjourned. Thank you.